Well, our next session is growing risk and liability of cyber threats. As we all are painfully aware, cyber threats are rapidly expanding as ransomware attacks hit every sector of our economy. How is the risk being managed? How are the attacks affecting liability, particularly for insurers? So in this session, a panel of cyber, insurance, and legal experts will provide some important insights on the current trends and solutions. Our moderator for the next session is Lucian Niemeyer, CEO, Building Cybersecurity, and former Assistant Secretary of Defense. So let me turn it over to Lucian to introduce the panelists and our next session.
Lucian? Yeah, I appreciate it very much. And I'm really excited about the opportunity to share the stage with two amazing thought leaders, in Catherine and Sarah, and really hoping to be able to capture all's attention over the next hour. We're not going to have slides, so we're going to have a discussion. I'm hoping that's okay for a change of pace, because I just feel like being able to freewheel a little bit on some of the trends of the day is going to be good. Just by way of background from myself, and we'll allow each other, the participants, to introduce themselves. I'm Lucian Niemeyer. In addition to building cybersecurity, my background is I spent 4 years in the senior level Department of Defense running the largest real estate portfolio in the world. And in doing so, realized that cyber threats across all sectors of our society, and not just within the Defense Department, but our schools, our water systems, our grid, is a growing threat as we embrace a smarter world. So I'll talk a little bit more about some thoughts there. I did want to take the opportunity to also remind folks, check the headlines right now. I don't know if for those of you who are watching what's going on across the ocean in Europe, we have now a pretty significant number of cyber attacks that are affecting public infrastructure, the grid, and just announced, looks like somebody took the cyber keys to the train system in Belarus to prevent the Russians from moving troops. So anybody that thinks that cyber is just somebody else's concern is probably not paying attention to the headlines. It has now become not just a part of global a threat, but also it's a way for not just countries, not just nation states, but cyber criminals and cyber hackers to either cause damage, create havoc, or in the case of ransomware attacks, extract a ransom. So I'm gonna go. First of all, I want to introduce our panelists, and then what we'll do is introduce them, and then a couple logistics issues, and then we'll get started. So first of all, Catherine Keefe is the cyber incident manager, the management leader with Marsh, and a pretty significant broker. I think probably Catherine, probably the world's leading insurance broker, and really happy to have her. She's spoken a lot about cyber risk. I think she'll have some great things to share with the group today. And also Sarah Goldstein, the partner of Baker Hostetler, also well known as far as her background on the legal concerns and issues regarding cybersecurity, which are playing themselves out right now. Right now, we will see some pretty spectacular cyber attacks be worked out in the courts for the next few years because of the unprecedented nature of the impact and ultimately the risk associated with them. So what I would like to do for just a couple of minutes, we're going to be tracking the chat and questions and answer. I'll be monitoring both. Definitely, as questions are popping up for the audience, please, I don't mind if you use either one. I'll be putting them out as far as I'll be checking both as we're talking with the panelists. So please, if you have specific questions, particularly where we're going with cyber risk and the insurance and legal ones, you please bring those up. If not, you'll rely on me for questions. And I always know that the questions come from the audience end up being a lot more focused and in many cases more compelling. So looking forward to be able to have audience participation for the day. I'm going to go ahead and open it up real quick for just a couple of minutes about what my organization is doing, and then I'll be turning it over to Catherine and ultimately over to Sarah. So just a little bit about what I've been working on since I left federal government. While I was in federal government and in the Pentagon, once I started understanding the true nature of the pervasive threat posed by cybersecurity across all sectors, I couldn't sleep. So I very much dedicated my life to running an organization that is called Building Cybersecurity. And if anybody wants more information, I've just put in the chat my email address. But the goal is really to work on a global framework to promote the adoption at every level in every sector of cybersecurity standards or a framework of controls. The organization that I'm a part of is partnered with other national associations, and we've created a pretty unprecedented series of easy to use controls that would allow you to be able to gain a certification. And the key for us is we're working with some of the leading insurance underwriters in the world that we want to use to incentivize the adoption of this framework, be able to mitigate risk, both for insurers and also for asset owners and anybody that employs smart technology. So for those on the call today, my guess is you are using smart technologies in all aspects of your society or in your systems, and it really does become a public infrastructure risk. Whether it be a water system, whether it be a local dam, whether it be a transportation system, we have to look as we're installing smart, where are we also increasing vulnerability and risk, and ultimately how do you get after it? That is the core function of the nonprofit that we are engaged in providing our country with what that framework should look like, how can it be certified, and ultimately how can it raise cyber protections for any asset, whether it be a car, whether it be your home, whether it be the essential services you rely on. How can we raise cyber protections for that so we don't really have to ever worry about losing the things that we hold dear near to us, whether it be the electricity that comes into our homes or our ability to be able to drive, or some of the more significant concerns that we have, particularly in cyber risk. So if anybody would like to find out more about the organization and what we are doing, and we also are looking for volunteers to be able to join us if you feel compelled to want to get involved with a solution, not just framing the problem, which I think we've been doing for years, to get involved with a solution that anybody can adopt and ultimately drive a better cyber safety. And we call it a safety posture, not a security posture, to protect lives, to protect property, and ultimately to ensure that we have access to the essential utilities we need for our quality of life and our existence. So I'd like to go ahead and now turn it over to Catherine to be able to talk a little bit about where she's coming from and how she's looking at the risk from one of the largest insurance brokers in the world. Catherine, go ahead.
Thanks, Lucian. I'm thrilled to be here today with all of the supporters and with my co-panelist, Sarah, who I've known for years. So where I, and I'm just going to play with my light here because my light is not very great. I come from in all this is that as Lucian introduced me, I lead the incident management practice at Marsh, which is indeed the world's largest insurance broker. But I'm steeped in this area in a couple of ways. I'm a recovering lawyer. So, 15 years ago, I was in private practice as a partner in law firms in the Philadelphia area. And I represented clients who were having data breaches all the time. And this was back before HIPAA was enacted. But clients, and particularly in the healthcare sector and not-for-profits, education, were really mindful about the importance of the data that they held and felt compelled to do the right thing, usually, if that data was impacted or breached in some way. And again, this was sort of absent a regulatory framework. And then in sort of the aughts came along the data breach notification laws in the various states. The HIPAA privacy and security rules were enacted. And lo and behold, we started having sort of this industry growing up around the value of data and incidents and breaches and expertise that was starting to be sort of assembled to assist organizations with all of these issues. Meantime, the insurance industry was looking at ways to ensure the risks that their policyholders were facing. And so what started as tech insurance or insurance for organizations with tech exposure turned the lens onto data exposure and data breaches. So when you think back, even as recently as 10 years ago, the cyber insurance market was really at its infancy. And I think where we are now is I almost like to look at this as a life cycle. We've gone in 10 years from infancy And I think we're in the teen years. I think we're hitting puberty now in the cyber insurance market. And I'll talk a little bit about why I think that, and also a little bit more about my experience. But we're at a point with cyber risk in cyber insurance and coverage and disputes over all of that, where there's a little bit of irrational behavior like a teenager. There's a little bit of reactive behavior because of the seriousness of the attack landscape that has changed so dramatically in this short amount of time of 10 years, that there are changes happening in the marketplace as we speak today. Before I joined Marsh a year and a half ago, I ran the breach response services team within Beazley. And Beazley, if you've never heard of it, is a London syndicate. It is an insurance carrier that specializes in many forms of insurance, but primarily in cyber insurance. And during my 8 years at Beazley in running this unit, we assisted probably in excess of 50,000 of our policyholders with a variety of data incidents and data breaches and ransomware attacks. And it's through that lens of jumping in and helping clients, helping them secure the expertise that they needed on the legal side, on the forensic side, helping sort through what extortion services are out there. If it was a data breach, a whole host of incident response services, mail houses. But back 10 years ago, we were talking about breach data from the perspective of unencrypted laptops, data that was stolen by insiders to monetize in certain tax fraud and other kinds of financial schemes. It wasn't 10 years ago, the onslaught of ransomware that we have today. And so as this time has gone on, in just 10 years' time, the insurance markets have changed their coverages, have expanded coverage to include things like ransomware exposures and the costs and third-party actions associated with ransomware. And we've seen the growth of coverage at the same time as we've seen the growth and sophistication and volume of cyber attacks. So what does this sort of boil away to now is that the claims that cyber insurance carriers are facing and are paying are extraordinary. And the underwriters and the carriers are now reacting by kind of, and this is not a, this is not a term of art, but they're putting the clamps down in terms of requiring policyholders to demonstrate a degree of security that hadn't been the case, even 5 years ago. So the claims environment is driving the insurance markets to expect more of our organizations by way of security. And at the same time, and I think in a good way, and we can debate this as panelists maybe, changing the behavior of organizations across the world in terms of holding them to account for security measures, incentivizing the right behavior with respect to improving security. And it's a very exciting time in the cyber insurance marketplace right now. And I think we will get past the teen years into a much more mature market where organizations will ultimately, either on their own or prodded by their cyber insurance carrier, will have improved security to a point where we'll be at a much more level playing field, and the markets themselves will also even out and provide, consistent coverage in a kind of a more rational manner than is what is happening now. So I'll stop there because that was a very high level view of kind of the romp from 15 years ago, 10 years ago to today, and we can unpack parts of that. But I'll stop and maybe turn it back to you, Lucian, or go over to Sarah for
so I've got, first of all, so many questions, and I don't think I could ever debate you, Catherine. I think all I can do is learn from you. So when you say open to debate with the panelists, I think we'll just be able to learn from each other. But there's so much we can unpack there. Before we do, I would love to be able to get Sarah to come up and talk a little bit about her background and how she's approaching this, and anything more you'd like to add to the discussion before we get into some questions. And please for those who are online, as if you have questions, please either chat or Q&A. I'm seeing some couple things come in on chat already. So and I'll turn it over to you, Sarah, and then we'll get going with the questions.
Great, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Great panel, great discussions, and really great to see the wide variety of organizations that participate. So great to be here. To give you a little bit of background about me, I'm a partner at the law firm Baker Hostetler. Baker Hostetler is a national law firm. We have offices all over the United States. I am based in the Philadelphia office, but work with clients all over the country. I'm part of the firm's digital assets and data management team. And the focus of my practice is on advising clients across industries. But I happen to work with many clients, states, state entities, municipalities, cities, many clients in the energy sector, investigate and also respond to both data security as well as data privacy incidents. And I've been in my role at Baker Hostetler for 4 years. I've had the privilege of working on some of the largest, most famous data breaches in history, including most notably the Marriott Starwood data breach that happened in 2018, where 500 million people were notified of an incident involving the Starwood's data prior to joining Marriott. And in my role, I work with Catherine, both in her current position and previously with many organizations that have cyber insurance. Baker Hostetler, my firm, is on panel for many, many cyber insurance carriers. So we get a lot of our clients through their cyber liability insurance policies, as well as clients that have been long-time clients of my law firm. And Baker Hostetler and my team, our role in a cyber incident is to serve as the quarterback, essentially, for the incident response process. So we'll work with our clients, we'll work with their cyber insurance carrier to identify who do we need to help us respond to this incident. The type of incidents that I work on range from your run-of-the-mill fraudulent wire transfer phishing incident involving unauthorized access to an email account to sophisticated state-sponsored network intrusions. Unfortunately, most of the matters I work on these days are ransomware attacks. There's a huge uptick in those. And I think really in 2021 is when ransomware was really front and center of the news with Colonial Pipeline and a lot of the other notable ransomware attacks that happened that year. I think it's much more part of the national consciousness. And now with what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, I think people are understanding that this really is a threat to everyone. And so with these incidents, we guide our clients through the process. We will engage forensic investigation firms that have the technical expertise to help us build a timeline of the incident. What happened? Can we determine why this happened? We can't always do that. And can we determine whether there was unauthorized access to or exfiltration of data? One important thing about having privacy counsel is that we're able to engage these vendors, whether it be a forensic investigation firm or other service providers under attorney-client privilege to help protect the findings from the investigations. Attorney-client privilege, it is a moving target. And we've seen a number of notable cases, specifically one with Capital One related to their data breach that shifted the landscape in terms of how we approach engaging vendors to help protect the findings from the investigation. So we are always monitoring what the courts are doing in this space to help best protect our clients. And so as the investigation proceeds, we help analyze the technical findings to then help the clients understand, okay, do we have any legal notification obligations? And then we help the clients understand, well, what are those notification obligations? Is it just under a contract, or are we dealing with state breach notification laws, federal breach notification laws? Also, depending on whether you're a state or federal contractor, there may be additional notification obligations that you have. We help prepare those notifications, those communications, and we try to best position the client to defend themselves against regulatory inquiries, as well as class action lawsuits, which we're seeing more and more of increasingly, and more of cases where we don't even notify that many people and there still are class action lawsuits. In terms of the trends that I've been seeing, in addition to sort of the explosive ransomware attacks, is really the amount of data access and exfiltration that we're seeing associated with ransomware attacks. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's so much more publicity now regarding ransomware attacks than there used to be. Up until, I would say, 2020, it was pretty rare for there to be a data breach associated with a ransomware attack. And the reason why is these ransomware attacks were just encryption events. Let's encrypt these people's data, and they're going to have to pay us because they don't have the encryption tool, the decryptor tool, and they don't have backups for the encrypted data. And they never really accessed the data. They never acquired the data. And then organizations, whether it's because of their cyber liability insurance policies or other frameworks that they're following, they became more sophisticated in terms of configuring their backups more appropriately. So when there was a ransomware attack, they would be able to restore from backups. They had no need to pay a demand. We saw a significant shift in 2020 to situations where not only was there encryption, but then the threat actors are also stealing data. And what a situation there is, well, if they don't have viable backups, they'll pay us. And if they do have viable backups, we're going to threaten them and publish their data unless they pay us. And so they would get a lot of organizations on one of those two threats, essentially. And what that has resulted in are these very large notification incidents related to these ransomware attacks. And so a lot of my focus of my practice is on these ransomware attacks and helping clients understand what data is involved, provide the notifications that are required, and also give tips along the way about things that organizations can do to help prevent these attacks from happening.
Yep. You've hit upon so many issues there, and man, I would love to be able to. We may not have enough time to talk about the Colonial Pipeline as an example, but that's exactly some of those class action lawsuits you're talking about are going after exactly what could have been a public health disaster, and I consider that a pretty significant issue for the All Housing Consortium. Wasn't, thank God, because the team at Colonial Pipeline took some proactive action to limit the damage. But we are looking at a cyber threat that's evolving from stealing data, from stealing the keys of the kingdom, which you mentioned, to be able to get in the system, to potentially causing harm. So the goal is, I guess, is for Catherine and I, eventually, Sarah, to put you out of business so there are no more lawsuits. So because we come up with those incentives, we come up with those ways to proactively protect our systems. So don't take it personally if we spend the rest of the time trying to figure out how do we not get to lawsuit phase.
Well, if I could pipe in, Lucian, I think that even if we can, tamp down the prevalence of third-party claims like class action lawsuits, I think the kind of services that, and someone just posted a question about expertise. I mean, the kind of service that Sarah and her practice at Baker Hostetler provide is also preventive in nature. So she didn't boast about the policy and procedure review and the preventive steps that organizations can take to better position themselves, which I think will never go out of style.
Yeah, no, look, we need that team. I get it
for that. So I just wanted to make sure that that as much as what's going on is reactionary, I think the experts in this field and the brokers and the insurance markets are trying to get everybody to a position where, this all can be minimized through taking the right steps. And it's just a lot of education for organizations.
So you brought up reactionary, and I think that's really what the folks on the call are looking at. How do we actually go from reactionary to incentives? You brought that up also in your earlier comments, Catherine. What can we do? And with the expertise that we all bring to, and everybody on the call, what can we do to move from reacting to ransomware attacks and recovering to trying to use the insurance industry as an incentive? I know that's something that we discussed earlier, getting ready for this calls. What practice we can put in place to actually incentivize asset owners across the board, whether it be public infrastructure, because right now you've got public infrastructure investors at risk. You've got bond. It's not just insurance companies, but other entities of risk that hold risk or at risk. How can we incentivize that? I love what you mentioned there. I love when you want to expound upon that.
Yeah, I think it's just maybe level set a little bit and talk about it, just mention for a moment, kind of the cost components here, because I think we're a long ways before the insurance markets incentivize behavior. I mean, there was a time 4 or 5 years ago where clients who felt that they had a good security posture would go to their cyber carrier and say, well, look at all these great things that I've done. I've instituted MFA, I've segmented my network, I've trained my employees on how not to click on a phishing link. I've done all these things, Mr. Carrier, will you please give me a discount? And the carriers were sort of fat and happy and just sort of laughed and said, no, we're not. We don't know enough about whether what you're doing is sufficient. You could do all these wonderful things and still get hit. So we're not quite comfortable yet to give you the carrot for doing those, taking those preventive steps. But now, because of the prevalence of ransomware and the costs associated with it, so just for a minute on the cost, it is not just the extraordinary ransom demands that are being made, which, we had one client pay a $40 million extortion payment last year. And so we are seeing demands in the tens of millions of dollars, and this is not uncommon, unfortunately. But the extortion payment side itself is not the only cost component. Typically, when organizations are ransomed in this way, their business stops for a period of time. And there is a huge cost to that, what we call business interruption. And that's an insurable cost. And so the carriers have been fielding these claims for business interruption and the extortion payment itself, reimbursement for that, the technical expertise of folks like Sarah and the forensics. So these costs add up. And to such a point that we're seeing the insurance markets react in such a way that forget incentives, just staying insurable is where the conversation is right now. And so really insurability is sort of increasingly dependent on security controls and things like MFA and endpoint detection and privileged access management, cyber response testing, hardening of your environment, lots of things that the underwriters are looking at. So I think there's no sort of financial incentive yet coming back from the carriers, but I think what is happening, and I mentioned this earlier, is it's a positive step forward in terms of organizations to stay insurable are incented to take these steps and really make sure they have the budget for security, make sure they're at least doing best practices in these various areas. Does that answer where you wanted to go with that?
Yeah, I mean, again, we're raising awareness for the folks on the call here, what the risks are, but also, where we're at right now with the risk managers and what they're faced with. I think that you gave a pretty good description of kind of the current state of play. I think the goal is what can we do working across all three entities, the legal side and the expertise that Sarah brings on how attackers are really truly getting in, and then what can we do with other experts to potentially create an incentive system. That's kind of what I've been working on for like the last year. And the bigger concern is how do you get folks to pay for it? No CEO wants to pay for risk mitigation. They want to pay for revenue growth. They want to pay for growing their brand. How do you create an incentive there? I think there's probably more we can do in that area. One question, Sarah, and we talked about this also early before this call, is that you have unique perspective, having done the forensics and seeing exactly how things happen and ultimately where we might be able to mitigate that. What would you recommend? I know we had a session previously on kind of things everybody can do. What would you recommend as some of the things organizations can do to strengthen their cybersecurity?
So I'll echo what Catherine said. If there's one takeaway from any of this, it's implementing multi-factor authentication for accounts that have access within your environment, and as well as to applications that you use. One other trend that I saw happen in 2020 and 2021 and continues is the scourge, if you will, or the epidemic of vendor attacks. So you might have your security squared away, you don't have any issues, but you need vendors to provide certain services to your organization. And in 2021, I had some clients who I'd never met before ever. And I worked on 5 matters with them because I had 5 different vendors that had significant data breaches involving my client's data. And as the data owner, our client is on the hook potentially for liability if their vendor had an incident involving their data. And so it really required us to do a re-examination of the contracts that we have with vendors and understanding the risks. Now, there are some vendors that you're never going to be able to negotiate the contract with. They're too big, you're too small, or they're just going to say, here it is, take it or leave it. And so if you're in a situation like that, you need to reevaluate, well, what data are we providing to this vendor? Do we really need to be providing that data to this vendor? So I think another takeaway in addition to MFA would be to better understand what data your organization is maintaining, where it is maintaining that data, and maybe taking a step back and thinking like, do we really need to have a database contain full social security numbers? Can we have them masked? Or do we even need social security numbers anymore? One of the big vendor breaches that I worked on in 2020 was involving a company named Blackbaud. So Blackbaud is an educational software service, or excuse me, not educational software. They provide donor relations management software and services. And so they had an attempted ransomware attack where the ransomware was not successful in terms of encrypting their data, but while the threat actors were in their environment, they took, I think it was 4 or 6 terabytes of data, which is a tremendous amount of information. And as a result of that, Blackbaud had to notify their clients that their data was involved in this incident. These clients range from schools, universities, hospitals, foundations. And so my firm, Baker Hostetler, we ended up representing over 300 clients of Blackbaud in responding and analyzing what notification obligations they had. And one of the takeaways is the language protecting these organizations was not very strong. They didn't really have much to go back to Blackbaud on. And had they perhaps reevaluated their contract, maybe they would have provided less information. Another takeaway from Blackbaud is people use these vendors for years and years and their staff turnover. And one of the biggest surprises of this was like, wow, we had no idea that we were providing this much information to our vendor. It was totally unnecessary to do that. So MFA, vendor due diligence. I think other tips that probably have been shared previously as well, software patching, doing that regularly, making sure that if you have, if you are utilizing different services, whether it's Microsoft Exchange or some other platforms, that you're paying attention and making sure that if there's any vulnerabilities identified, that you're patching those appropriately. Also, employee training is huge. There's always a human element to these incidents. With ransomware attacks, it's often an employee receiving an email and downloading a malicious attachment that potentially could have been prevented. We've also seen something called shadow IT, when people may have good intentions, but they decide to do their own workarounds to get work done, and they create vulnerabilities within the network environment. So whether it's using their own computers or using some other internet connection and exposing that environment to threat actors just looking for an opportunity to pounce.
Yeah, we're starting to see concepts. Matter of fact, the White House just put out a federal strategy for zero trust architecture, where you have to assume as you're building you're refreshing and updating your networks, that there is zero trust for everything that's coming in. And matter of fact, that was a big issue years ago. Matter of fact, our first question that came in on the chat, which I very much appreciate, I'm sure, Sarah, you remember the Target breach, the department store, where they went in through a third-party vendor. As you know, it was a third-party vendor that was maintaining the HVAC equipment, and they inserted a malware unintentionally that ultimately spread to all the systems and data, and in some cases customer information within Target. The question actually is, it's a little bit more probably as much for Catherine. As we're looking at that stealing of personal data, how is there any services or products within the insurance industry to be able to offer someone recovery from that? And specifically the question is, what's work's been done to support a cyber insurance to protect private citizen protected information? That's a question I've never really thought about, Catherine. I'm not sure if you've had any insight on that.
Well, I know that, and I have experience with this, Sarah does too, where there is a sort of a bona fide data breach of personally identifiable information. You know, someone's social security number, their medical record identification, health plan identification, things like that. There are products out in the market that organizations can offer affected individuals, persons affected by the breach, to set up credit monitoring and monitor any impact to the credit file, or offer identity theft monitoring, dark web monitoring. So there are products, they're not perfect, and they don't really get to the nub of the issue, which is preventing, you know, the attack in the first place. They're sort of, the horse is already out of the barn. And frankly, in the Target breach and other credit card situations, really that kind of remediation is not really square peg, square hole. If there's a credit, if your credit card is compromised in some way, the real remedy is to call the issuer and get a new credit card and have this covered by the card brand, right? But where your social security number is compromised, in the wrong hands, that can be used to open up accounts and do some real financial damage and reputational damage. So where those products are designed to offer some modicum of support to consumers. And in ransomware, as Sarah said, where there isn't really a data breach, in the true encryption, there's never really a need to go there because the individual's data wasn't compromised as it would have been in a classic data breach situation. So it's, you know, I don't know, Sarah, what your opinion is, but are you seeing fewer or a level off of these offers of these remediation products?
No, I still think that these remediation products are still being offered where socials or driver's license numbers are involved in an incident. But what I am seeing is a significant reduction in the number of people that actually take these companies up on their offer to enroll. It used to be that we saw, I don't know, around 5 to 8, maybe 10% of people notified calling up and saying, yes, I want to enroll in credit monitoring services. The last big incident that I did, less than 2% of the people offered credit monitoring services enrolled. And that could be because of breach fatigue. People already are enrolled in services. They don't need another service. I also do think that there have been some increased attention to data retention and what data is being maintained. There's the new laws in California. There's increasing attention from the White House. I also think that there's been changes made to the fraud alerts and the credit freezes that you can put on your credit report. There used to be a fee associated with those, with the 3 reporting agencies. Those were eliminated, I believe, in 2019. So it's becoming easier for people to take control to the extent they can over their personal information, whether it's through these services or through the offerings from the federal government.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an area where we do need to maintain a diligence, and citizens need to take some measures in their own hands to ensure they are enrolling in these for those protection. It's funny because if it's not happening to you or not happening to somebody you know, you have a tendency to lose sight of it. And that's really what we're seeing across the board. Cyber threats, no one really understands how it affects them, can affect them personally. And those threats continue to grow, particularly as we move to a whole new level of cyber criminals and cyber hackers. Hey, one question also came in the chat, and I want to get to it because I do love these questions that are coming in. So we've been talking, and maybe Catherine, start with you. We're talking about mainly using insurance policies to prevent business or recover from business disruption or to address data issues. Are you seeing an emerging concern for what would be important for a lot of folks on the call about hazards, about actual physical damage or casualty risk? You're starting to see insurance companies look at, okay, how do you protect data to how do you actually protect lives and through the protection of operational technologies, critical infrastructure. Did you want to, I know that we've been given that some thought. Anything more you want to add to that question?
Well, the sort of the OTI, or the operational technology infrastructure side of it, is emerging as greater, of greater importance. And back in the day when we were just concerned about data, manufacturers, for example, or utilities don't maintain, manufacturers primarily don't maintain a lot of that personally identifiable data except for their employees. But then as the attackers figured out that they could compromise, manufacturing lines and other, business operations, the gaze kind of turned over to OTI, or operational technology, and the potential compromises there. And policies started to be expanded to include compromises to the OTI. And, we at Marsh and the carriers have specific questions, assessment questions, where we sit down with clients and address, whether and how their OTI is or could be vulnerable from a security perspective, which is a different kind of analysis from cybersecurity in the IT space. So there is this sort of growing expertise on OTI coverage for that. And then you've got the sort of the confluence of the different kinds of insurance policies. So bodily harm and other kinds of physical damage is picked up not so much under existing cyber policies today, but rather under property policies or other forms of coverage that organizations have. So it's really good to sit down with your experts, your brokers, and talk very thoroughly through whether the existing coverage you have contemplates these newer threats and risks. Because as organizations are finding, traditional forms of coverage may not stretch to cover these newer threats. And while the carriers and brokers are, running as fast as they can to catch the train that's left the station, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to revise these policies to reflect these new risks and realities, particularly on the OT side.
Yeah. So we're down, believe it or not, we've flown by on the time here. We've only got 3 minutes left. What I like to do is, for the folks who are in the audience, Catherine and Sarah, you could boil down into a minute, what advice would you want to give to folks and ultimately how to get smarter on this issue or to address this issue? I think that'd be great to finish off with some just quick hits of advice.
I would say,
Catherine
I would
first.
start by saying, listen to your CISO organization, listen to your CISO. When he or she asks for budget, don't be a pushover, but listen to your CISO, because they are doing God's work in terms of, establishing a perimeter around your organization of security. I'd also encourage organizations to look past the external perimeter and look at the second and third lines of defense. And by that, I mean the ransomware attackers are moving to elicit support from insiders and are paying insiders to help perpetrate these ransomware attacks. So where the perimeter is strong, there may be a soft underbelly of disassociated or disaffected employees who could be easily convinced to participate in the crime and benefit from it financially. So stay in touch with your employees, conduct training, awareness. I think particularly with the pandemic and people feeling, kind of isolated, these crimes can be maybe even more likely to occur without vigilance. So I would say it's the hard stuff, but it's also the soft stuff with your people in training.
So Sarah, is there anything that you feel is absolutely important for the folks to be able to take away from this?
Yeah, I think attending webinars like this, very important. I also think doing tabletop exercises. So on top of training, actually going through a simulation of what would happen if an incident were to occur at your organization, bring those folks in the room, put 4 or 5 hours on the schedule. And I do this with a lot of clients, and we walk through a real life scenario as to, well, how would we respond? And what does the incident response plan say? What doesn't the plan say and what it should say? And that sort of brings everyone together to focus on something when everyone's so busy with their real jobs that they may not get the opportunity to come together to actually go through a scenario. And I think that's really, really helpful for organizations.
Yeah, and then from my perspective, answering my own question, for folks in the community on the call, they'll have hospitals and they have schools and they have water systems and they've got other community infrastructure. You've got to start asking folks, okay, how are we postured to protect the smart technologies also to protect the way they're designed and integrated and how they're operated and sustained over the life cycle of that building or of that asset. And we really have to look holistically across all sectors on how do we enhance security. That's one thing that we are working on in the nonprofit building site security. So I want to thank Laura and George for the opportunity on this panel. It's been incredible. I could learn for another 2 hours from Catherine and Sarah. So thank you both for taking the time this afternoon. And we did put in the chat email addresses. I know Sarah's and mine's in there. Catherine, if you want to add yours, if you have any further follow-up questions, please get a hold of us individually. Thank you, Laura. Thank you for the All Hazards Consortium for allowing us to talk about this today, and as well as to George. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Lucian, Catherine, Sarah, what a great session. I never took so many notes in such a short period of time. That was outstanding. I think you've whet all our appetites to go back and probably lose a lot of sleep, but I think you got us with a lot of takeaways. So thanks very much for your information.
All right, Catherine and Sarah, again, thank you so much. I would love to follow up with you. There's a couple of things I think I came away from the call with. I'd love to discuss more with you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
All right, take care. You guys have a great afternoon.